Hello, everyone. Got a few dirty jokes for you today.
So, a son says to his dad, "Hey dad, what is an alcoholic?" The dad puts his arm around his son and says, "Well, son, you see those 4 trees over there? An alcoholic would see 8 trees." And the son says, "But dad, there are only 2 trees there." So the wife crashed her car again. She told the police that the man she collided with was on his phone, drinking a beer. The policeman shook his head and said, "Lady, that man could do what he liked. It was his living room." So an Irishman, an Italian, and a Polish guy are sitting in a bar. They're all having a good time, and the Irishman says, "This is a nice place, but back home in Dublin, there's a bar that's even better. At McCarthy's, you buy a drink, you buy another drink, and then McCarthy himself buys your 3rd drink." The others nod. That does sound like a good deal. Then the Italian chimes in. "That's nice, but over in Brooklyn, there's a bar called Tony's. You buy a drink, Tony buys you one. You buy another drink, Tony buys you another. It just keeps going like that. Everyone agrees that's even better." Finally, the Polish guy grins and says, "You think that's good? Where I come from, there's a bar called Kowalski's. At Kowalski's, they buy you your 1st drink. They buy you your 2nd drink. They buy you your 3rd drink, and then they take you in the back and get you laid." The other 2 stare in disbelief. "No way. Did that actually happen to you?" The Polish guy shakes his head and says, "Not me, but it happened to my sister." So a woman hears a knock at her door and opens it to find 2 men standing on her porch. She recognizes them as her husband's co-workers from the local brewery. One of the men clears his throat and says gently, "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband passed away at work today. He drowned in a vat of beer." The woman gasps, clutching her chest. "Oh, my dear Michael. He didn't stand a chance." The second man shakes his head and says, "Well, that's not exactly the case. You see, he got out 3 times to take a piss." So a man rushed into a bar and ordered a double martini. The man downed it with 1 swallow, put a $5 bill on the bar, and turned and rushed out of the bar. The bartender picked up the $5 bill and folded it carefully and tucked it in his vest pocket. Just at that moment, he looked up at the boss standing in the doorway staring at him. Doing a bit of fast thinking, he said, "Hi, boss. Did you see that fellow just now? Came in here, bought a double martini, gave me a $5 tip, and rushed out without paying." So a police officer spots a car swerving erratically across the highway lanes and flips on his sirens. He pulls the driver over and strides to the window, his flashlight cutting through the dusk. Leaning in, he says, "Sir, please blow into this breathalyzer." The driver, a wiry man with a nervous grin, shakes his head. "Can't, officer. I'm asthmatic. It'll trigger a bad attack." The officer raises an eyebrow, unfazed. "All right, then we'll need a blood sample at the station." The driver's grin fades, and he rubs his neck. "Sorry, can't do that either. I'm a hemophiliac. I'd bleed out." Growing impatient, the officer adjusts his stance. "Fine. How about a urine sample?" The driver sighs dramatically, slumping back in his seat. "Nope, diabetic here. That'll mess with my blood sugar." The officer's jaw tightens, but he points to the road's white line glinting under the streetlights. "Okay, step out and walk this line." The driver's eyes twinkle mischievously as he flashes a wide grin. "Can't do that either. Why not? The officer snaps, his patience wearing thin. The driver chuckles, leaning forward. Because I'm way too drunk. So an angry wife was complaining about her husband spending so much of his free time in the local bar. So one night he took her along with him. "What'll you have?" he asked. "Oh, I don't know. The same as you, I suppose," she replied. So the husband ordered a couple of Jack Daniels and threw his down in one shot. His wife watched him, then took a sip from her glass and immediately spit it out. "Yuck, that's terrible," she spluttered. "I don't know how you can drink this stuff." "Well, there you go," cried the husband. "And you think I'm out enjoying myself every night?" So the annual Beer Producers Conference wraps up, and the presidents of the top beer companies, buzzing from a day of debates, spill into a cozy bar. The air hums with their chatter as they settle around a large oak table. A waitress, balancing a tray with practiced ease, weaves through the crowd to take their orders. The president of Budweiser, loosening his collar, speaks first. "Budweiser," he says with a satisfied nod. The Miller president, tapping his watch, follows suit. "Miller Lite," he orders, leaning back with a grin. Adolf Coors, his face weathered from years in the industry, doesn't hesitate. "Coors," he says, his voice firm. One by one, each exec orders their brand's flagship beer, a parade of loyalty. The waitress finally reaches Arthur Guinness, whose calm presence and sharp gaze draw curious glances. She raises an eyebrow. "And you, Mr. Guinness?" To everyone's shock, he leans forward, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "Coke." The table goes quiet, glasses pausing mid-sip. The Budweiser president blinks in disbelief. "Why don't you order a Guinness?" he asks, his voice tinged with confusion. Arthur's smirk widens as he shrugs. "Nah, if you guys won't drink beer, then neither will I." So two fellows have been at the bar now for quite a while, downing several mugs with abandon. They both look at the far end of the bar, in the direction of an unattractive woman who came in a while back. The first fellow looks back at the second fellow and says, "You know, that woman is looking better and better, isn't she?" The second fellow takes another look at the woman, then looks back at his friend and says, "Well, I guess what they say is true then." The first fellow asks, "Well, what do they say?" The second fellow answers, "Beauty is in the eye of the beer holder." So a drunk old man sat hunched over the bar when a sharp-looking young guy walked in and asked the bartender for an 18-year-old scotch. The bartender poured him a drink, but as soon as the man sipped it, he frowned. No. This is a 12-year-old. I asked for an 18. The bartender apologized, rushed off, and brought back another glass. The man tasted it and shook his head. Closer, but this one's a 14. I want the 18. A little flustered, the bartender returned with another glass. The man sipped, smiled, and said, "Ah, that's the one." The old drunk had been watching the whole thing in amazement. Finally, he staggered out of the bar and came back a minute later with a bottle in a brown paper sack. He plopped it in front of the Scotch connoisseur and slurred, "Here, pal, try this." The young man took a sip, then immediately spit it out. "Good Lord, that tastes like piss." The old drunk grinned. "Spot on. Now, how old am I?" So an elderly man is pulled over by the police around 2 in the morning. The officer shines his light in the car and asks, "Sir, where are you going at this hour?" The old man answers calmly, "I'm on my way to a lecture about alcohol abuse. the effects it has on the human body, and the dangers of smoking and staying out late. The officer raises an eyebrow. A lecture? At 2 in the morning? Who on earth is giving that? The man sighs and says, "That would be my wife." So a good Samaritan was walking home late one night when he came across a drunk lying on the sidewalk. Wanting to help, he asked, "Do you live here?" The drunk slurred, "Yep. Would you like me to help you upstairs?" "Yep." So the Samaritan carried him inside, up the stairs, and asked, "Is this your floor?" "Yep." The Samaritan suddenly realized he didn't want to run into the man's wife. She might think he was the one who got him drunk. So he just opened the first door he saw, shoved the drunk through it, and went back downstairs. But outside, there was another drunk lying on the sidewalk. He asked, "Do you live here?" "Yep." "Want me to help you upstairs?" "Yep." So up they went, and again the Samaritan pushed him through the same door. Then he went back down. Sure enough, outside was yet another drunk. But before the Samaritan could even ask, the drunk stumbled toward a policeman and cried, "Officer, please protect me. This guy keeps dragging me upstairs, then throwing me down the elevator shaft." So, an American walks into an Irish pub and says, "I'll give anyone $100 if they can drink 10 Guinnesses in 10 minutes. Most people just ignore the absurd bet and go back to their conversations. One guy even leaves the bar. A little while later, that guy comes back and asks the American, "Is that bet still on?" "Sure," he says. So the bartender lines 10 Guinnesses up on the bar. The Irishman drinks them all in less than 10 minutes. As the American hands over the money, he asks, "Where did you go when you just left?" The Irishman answers, "I went next door to the other pub to see if I could do it." So an extremely shy and modest man checked into the hospital for a series of tests. The last test upset his stomach badly. After making several false alarm trips to the bathroom, he figured the next cramp was just another false alarm and stayed in bed. Suddenly, the dam burst and he completely soiled his sheets. Mortified beyond reason, he leapt out of bed, bundled the messy sheets together, and panicked. Not knowing what else to do, he hurled them right out the hospital window. Down on the street, a drunk happened to be staggering by when the sheets landed on him. Flailing and cursing, he wrestled with the mess until it dropped in a heap at his feet. Just then, a security guard who had seen the whole thing walked up and asked, "What on earth just happened here?" Still staring at the pile, the drunk muttered, "I'm not sure, but I think I just beat the crap out of a ghost." So a drunk is driving through the city, and his car is weaving violently all over the road. An Irish cop pulls him over. "So," says the cop to the driver, "where have you been?" "I've been to the pub," slurs the drunk. "Well," says the cop, "it looks like you've had quite a few." "I did all right," the drunk says with a smile. "Did you know," says the cop, standing straight and folding his arms, "that a few intersections back, your wife fell out of your car?" "Oh, thank heavens," sighs the drunk. "For a minute there, I thought I'd gone deaf." So a chemistry professor wanted to teach his 5th grade class about the dangers of liquor. For his demonstration, he set 2 glasses on the desk, one filled with water, the other with whiskey. He then produced 2 live worms. "Now, class, watch carefully," he said. He dropped the first worm into the glass of water, and it wriggled around happily. Then he placed the second worm into the glass of whiskey. It twisted, writhed in pain, and quickly sank to the bottom, dead. The professor looked at the class and asked, "So, what lesson do we learn from this experiment?" From the back of the room, Johnny raised his hand and proudly declared, "If you drink whiskey, you'll never get worms." So an Asian guy steps up to the bar next to a big fella and orders a drink. As they both start sipping, the big guy leans over and says, "Hey, you know any of the martial arts like kung fu or karate?" The Asian guy sets his glass down and frowns. "Wow, that's pretty racist. You think just because I'm Asian, I must know martial arts?" The big guy shakes his head. "No," I asked, "because you're drinking my damn beer." So a guy walks into a bar and orders 3 beers. The bartender pours them and then watches as the man goes through a strange little ritual. With each beer, he raises the glass and says, "Happy birthday, happy birthday, happy birthday," then downs them one by one. After that, he pays and leaves. Exactly 1 year later, the same man walks in, orders 3 beers, and repeats the ritual. The bartender, now curious, finally asks, "Hey buddy, why 3 beers and all the birthdays?" The man smiles and explains, "Well, I've got 2 best friends, one in Ireland, one in Australia. We all share the same birthday. Since we can't be together, we promised each other that every year, we'd each go to our local pub and drink a round for the other 2. We've kept the tradition since we were 1855 years now." The bartender is touched and nods. The next year, the man comes in again, but this time, he only orders 2 beers. The bartender quietly serves them, watching as the man raises each one and says, "Happy birthday, happy birthday." Finally, the bartender can't hold it in. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Which friend passed away?" The man looks up, confused. "What? Nobody died." "Then why only 2 drinks?" the bartender asks. The man shrugs and says, "Oh, I gave up drinking." So a Texan, a New Yorker, and a guy from New Jersey were drinking in a bar. The Texan finished his glass of tequila, tossed the half-full bottle into the air, pulled out his pistol, and shot it to pieces. The other 2 stared at him in shock, but the Texan just puffed out his chest and said, "Where I come from, we've got plenty of tequila." Not to be outdone, the New Yorker drained his glass of wine, hurled his bottle into the air, and blasted it apart. Smirking, he declared, "Where I come from, we've got plenty of fine wine and the best of everything." The guy from New Jersey calmly finished his wrangling, tossed the empty bottle up, pulled out his pistol, and shot the New Yorker dead. Then he caught the bottle on the way down and said, "Where I come from, we recycle bottles, and we've got way too many New Yorkers." So a herd of buffalo can move only as fast as the slowest. When the herd is hunted, it is the slowest and weakest ones at the back that are killed first. This natural selection is good for the herd as a whole, because the general speed and health of the whole group keeps improving by the regular killing of the weakest members. In much the same way, the human brain can only operate as fast as the slowest brain cells. Excessive intake of alcohol, we all know, kills brain cells, but naturally it attacks the slowest and weakest brain cells first. In this way, regular consumption of beer eliminates the weaker brain cells, making the brain a faster and more efficient machine. That's why you always feel smarter after a few beers. So Bob walked into a bar and ordered martini after martini. Each time, he plucked the olive out, dropped it into a jar, and downed the drink. When the jar was finally full of olives and all the martinis were gone, he stood up to leave. A curious customer watching the whole thing, stopped him and asked, "Hey, buddy, what was that all about?" Bob shrugged and said, "Nothing. My wife just told me to pick up a jar of olives." So two Aussie tourists are hiking through the misty Scottish Highlands when, to their surprise, they spot a pub. Thrilled, they head inside. "2 pints of your finest ale, barman," says one Aussie. They're stunned when the barman pours the drinks and says, "That'll be 2 pennies, thanks." The Aussies glance at each other in disbelief and ask why it's so cheap. The barman smiles and says, "It's our 800-year birthday today, here at the Hilltop Pub, so we're charging the same for a pint as we did 800 years ago." The Aussies quickly forget about hiking and settle in for the long haul, ordering 2 more pints again, 2 pennies. As they drink, they notice a group of men at the far end of the bar, just sitting there, not touching a drop. When the barman comes back, they point at the group and say how strange it is they're not drinking. The barman shrugs and says, "Oh, them, don't worry about them. They're just locals. They're waiting for happy hour." So in the early part of the 20th century, when revenuers were busy chasing down moonshine stills in the Appalachians, a young federal agent rode into a small mountain town. He was sharp-looking in his starched khakis, badge shining, and full of ambition to make his mark by busting up a big still. He started questioning the townsfolk, but nobody told him a thing except that it might be best if he moved along. Then, off to the side, he noticed a teenage boy hanging around and decided to give it a try. "Do you know of any stills on the mountainside?" asked the revenuer. "I sure do," replied the boy. "I'll give you $1 if you tell me where they are," said the revenuer. "Sure, I'll give you a map." "Where is the money?" asked the boy. "Here is 50 cents. I'll give you the rest when I get back if you have been honest with me," said the revenuer, handing over the coins. "But you ain't coming back," shouted the boy. So a man walks into a bar, grabs a drink, and after a while heads to the bathroom. When he comes back, he leans on the counter and says to the bartender, "You've got a great place, but my buddy was here last night, and he said you have golden urinals." "Where are they?" The bartender freezes for a second, then turns toward the band on stage. Cupping his hands, he yells, "Frank, I've got a lead on the guy who pissed in your saxophone." So 2 guys, Patrick and Michael, were drifting in a lifeboat after narrowly escaping a burning freighter. While searching through the boat's supplies, Patrick came across an old lamp. Hoping for the best, he gave it a good rub, and to his amazement, out popped a genie. The genie said, "I can only grant you 1 wish, not 3. Make it count." Without thinking twice, Patrick blurted out, "Turn the whole ocean into Guinness beer." With a thunderous clap, the genie granted the wish. Instantly, the sea all around them became the finest Guinness ever brewed, and then the genie vanished. The 2 men sat in silence, the lifeboat gently rocking on a sea of beer. Finally, Michael glared at Patrick and snapped, "Brilliant move, Patrick. Now we're stuck here, and we've got to pee in the boat." So 2 airplane mechanics were killing time in a fogged-in hangar at JFK Airport. With no planes coming or going, they were bored out of their minds. One of them leaned back on a toolbox and said, "Man, you got anything to drink?" The other shook his head. "Nah, but I heard you can drink jet fuel and it'll kinda give you a buzz." The first guy raised an eyebrow, then grinned. "Well, nothing else to do." So they cracked into the fuel and got absolutely hammered, laughing and carrying on like only drinking buddies can. The next morning, One of them woke up expecting the worst hangover of his life. But when he opened his eyes, he realized something strange. He felt fantastic. No pounding head, no nausea. In fact, he felt better than ever. Just then, the phone rang. It was his buddy from the hangar. "Hey," the buddy asked, sounding cheerful. "How do you feel?" The mechanic laughed in surprise. "Great, just great. No hangover at all." "Same here," his buddy said, excited. "That jet fuel stuff is amazing. We should do this more often." The man chuckled, but hesitated. "Yeah, maybe, but there's just one thing." "What's that?" his buddy asked. The man's voice dropped. "Did you fart yet?" There was a pause on the line. "No." "Well, don't," the man warned, "because I'm calling you from Phoenix." So yesterday, scientists for Health Canada suggested that the results of a recent analysis revealed the presence of female hormones in beer and suggested that men should take a look at their beer consumption. The theory is that drinking beer makes men turn into women. To test the theory, 100 men were each fed 6 pints of beer within a 1-hour period. It was then observed that 100% of the men gained weight, talked excessively without making sense, became overly emotional, couldn't drive, failed to think rationally, argued over nothing, had to sit down while urinating and refused to apologize when wrong. No further testing is planned. So Pat and Mike came to America together years ago. They married sisters, lived on the same block, and spent nearly every evening drinking together at the same bar. One day, Pat fell seriously ill and was taken to the hospital. Mike came to visit, and when he walked into the room, he said, "Pat, you're looking good." Pat shook his head. "Don't be lying to me, Mike. I'm dying, and I won't last much longer." Mike pulled up a chair and sat by his old friend. Pat took his hand and said, "Mike, when I'm gone and buried, and the priest has said his last words, will you do one last thing for me?" "Anything," Mike said quietly. Pat smiled weakly. "We've been drinking whiskey together since the day we landed in this country. When I'm laid in the ground, I want you to take a bottle, pour it all over my grave, and let it soak through the earth so I can quench my thirst in the hereafter." Mike gave Pat a long, thoughtful look, his eyes misting over. Finally, he nodded. "Pat, with all we've been through, it's the least I can do." Then he paused, leaned closer, and added, "But tell me one thing, would you mind if I passed it through my kidneys first?" So a drunken wino was staggering down the street, one foot on the curb and the other in the gutter. A cop pulled up, took one look, and said, "All right, buddy, I've got to take you in. You're obviously drunk." The wino blinked at him and slurred, "Officer, are you absolutely sure I'm drunk?" "Yeah, pal, I'm sure," the cop replied. "Let's go." The wino let out a huge sigh of relief. "Thank God, I thought I was a cripple." So a man had a little too much to drink at a party. His friends offered to drive him home, but he waved them off. "No need, I only live a mile away." About 5 blocks from the party, the police spotted him weaving and pulled him over. They asked him to step out and walk the line. Just as he was about to start, the police radio crackled with an urgent call, a robbery in progress just a block away. "Stay put, we'll be right back," the officers told him, then sprinted toward the scene. After a few minutes, the man figured, "What the hell?" and drove himself home. When he got there, he told his wife, "Listen, if anyone comes by asking for me, just say I've been in bed all day with the flu." Then he went upstairs and crashed. A few hours later, there was a knock at the door. His wife answered to find two police officers. "Does Mr. Smith live here?" they asked. "Yes, he does," she said. "May we see him?" "He's in bed with the flu," she replied firmly. "Been there all day." The officers exchanged a look. "Miss, can we see his car?" Puzzled, she led them to the garage and opened the door. There sat a police cruiser with its lights still flashing. So Paddy had been drinking at his local Dublin pub all day and most of the night, celebrating Ireland's big football victory. Finally, Mick the bartender shook his head and said, "That's it, Paddy. You'll not be drinking any more tonight." Paddy nodded and said, "All right then, Mick. I'll be on me way." He spun around on his bar stool, tried to step off, and fell flat on his face. He pulled himself up, dusted off his pants, took a step toward the door, and fell flat on his face again. Determined, he crawled across the floor, grabbed the doorframe, and stuck his head outside. The fresh night air hit him, and he thought, that'll do it. He stepped onto the sidewalk, only to fall flat on his face once more. "By Jesus, I'm tanked," he groaned. But he could see his house just a few doors down, so he crawled the rest of the way, hauled himself up the front door, and stumbled inside. Looking up the staircase, he muttered, "No bloody way." Then he got down on hands and knees and crawled all the way up to his bedroom. At the door, he whispered, "If I can just make it to my bed." He took one step, collapsed, flat on his face again, and finally grunted, "To hell with it." He crawled under the covers and passed out. The next morning, his wife Jess came in with a cup of coffee. "Paddy," she said, "did you have a bit to drink last night?" Paddy groaned. "Yes, Jess, I did. I was pissed drunk. But how'd you know?" Jess sighed. Mick called. "You left your wheelchair at the pub." So proudly showing off his new apartment to a couple of his friends late one night, a drunk man led them straight into his bedroom. Against the wall stood a huge brass gong. One of his buddies frowned and asked, "What's that big brass gong for?" The drunk grinned. "That's not a gong. It's a talking clock." His friend raised an eyebrow. "A talking clock? Seriously?" "Yup," the drunk replied proudly. The second guest squinted at it. "All right then, how does it work?" "Watch this," the drunk said. He grabbed a hammer, wound up, and gave the gong a thunderous pound that shook the room. The three of them stood in silence, waiting. Finally, from the other side of the wall, a muffled, angry voice shouted, "For crying out loud, you idiot. It's 3 in the morning." So there was a wild party in the woods one night, when suddenly the sky opened up with pouring rain and rolling thunder. Two young men, already tipsy, dashed through the storm for nearly 10 minutes before reaching their car. Soaked to the bone, they jumped inside, started the engine, and sped off down the dark country road. Still laughing and drinking beer, they tried to shake off the scare of the storm. But then out of nowhere, an old man's face appeared outside the passenger window. He tapped lightly on the glass. The passenger froze, wide-eyed, and shrieked, "Look at my window. There's an old guy's face there. Is that a ghost?" The old man kept knocking. The driver, pale but trying to stay calm, said, "Well, open the window a crack and ask him what he wants." Hands trembling, the passenger rolled it down an inch. "Well, what do you want?" he stammered. The old man leaned closer and asked softly, "Do you have any tobacco?" The passenger nearly fainted. "He wants tobacco." "Then give him a cigarette. Hurry," the driver barked. The passenger fumbled through his pack, shoved a cigarette into the old man's hand, and then frantically rolled up the window. "Step on it!" he screamed. The driver floored it, and the car shot forward. They were soon going 80 miles an hour, trying to calm down. Breathing hard, the passenger muttered, "What the hell was that? I mean, how could that be?" We were flying down the road. Before the driver could answer, there was another knock on the window. The passenger spun around. "Oh no, he's back." Sure enough, the old man's face was there again. The driver shouted, "Well, see what he wants now." With shaking hands, the passenger cracked the window again. Yes." The old man smiled faintly. "Do you have a light?" The passenger screamed, threw a lighter out the window and rolled it back up. "Step on it," he yelled. Now, the speedometer crept past 100, the two of them chugging beer and trying desperately to forget the nightmare. But just as they began to catch their breath, knock, 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 the passenger nearly lost it. He rolled the window down and screamed, "What do you want?" The old man calmly replied, "You boys want some help getting out of the mud?" So I was sitting at the bar yesterday, sipping my beer when my stomach started to churn. I realized I desperately needed to fart. The music in the bar was blasting, so I thought I was safe. I timed each fart with the heavy beats of the songs, letting them rip in rhythm. After a couple of tracks, I was feeling much better. I finished my beer, leaned back in relief, and then noticed the entire bar staring at me. That's when it hit me. I wasn't listening to the bar's music. I had my earbuds in, blasting my iPod. So, a drunk walks into a bar and says, "Bartender, buy everyone in the house a drink. Pour yourself one, and give me the bill." So, the bartender does just that, and hands the man the bill. The drunk says, "I haven't got it." The bartender slaps the guy around a few times, then throws him out into the street. The very next day, the same drunk walks into the bar and once again says, "Bartender, buy everyone in the house a drink, pour yourself one, and give me the bill." The bartender figures that he can't possibly be stupid enough to pull the same trick twice, so he gives him the benefit of the doubt. He pours a round of drinks for the house, has a drink himself, and hands the drunk the bill. Again, the drunk says, "I haven't got it." The bartender can't believe it. He picks the guy up, beats the living daylights out of him, and then throws him out into the street. The next day, the same drunk walks back into the same bar and says, "Bartender, buy everyone in the house a drink and give me the bill." In disgust, the bartender says, "What? No drink for me this time?" The drunk replies, "Nope. You get too violent when you drink." So a man walks in an Alaskan bar and shouts, "Free beers outside." So, everyone in the bar, except the bartender, ran outside in excitement. The bartender, visibly angry, yells at the man, "What did you do that for?" "Now, I have no customers." The man says, "Sorry, mister. I honestly didn't think any of those men would be brave enough to fight a grizzly bear, let alone 3 of them." So a guy stumbles through the front door of a bar and makes his way to the counter. He slaps a hand on the bar and orders a beer. The bartender takes one look at him and says, "Sorry, sir, I can't serve you. You've already had too much to drink." The drunk grumbles, swears under his breath, and staggers back out the door. 5 minutes later, he comes crashing through the side door of the same bar, waving his arms and shouting for a beer. The bartender shakes his head and says again, "Sir, I told you already, I can't serve you. You've had enough." 10 minutes after that, the man comes barreling in through the back door, wobbling up to the bar and demands another drink. The bartender sighs. Look, sir, I'm sorry, but you really need to leave. You've had far too much tonight. The drunk stares at him for a moment, squints, and finally says, My God, man, how many bars do you work at? So I had 18 bottles of whiskey in my cellar and was told by my wife that I had a drinking problem and to empty the contents of each and every bottle down the sink, or else. I said I would and proceeded with the unpleasant task. I withdrew the cork from the first bottle and poured the contents down the sink with the exception of one glass, which I drank. I then withdrew the cork from the second bottle and did likewise with it, with the exception of one glass, which I drank. I then withdrew the cork from the third bottle and poured the whiskey down the sink, which I drank. I pulled the cork from the fourth bottle down the sink and poured the bottle down the glass, which I drank. I pulled the bottle from the cork of the next and drank one sink out of it and threw the rest down the glass. I pulled the sink out of the next glass and poured the cork down the bottle. Then I corked the sink with the glass, bottled the drink, and drank the pour. When I had everything emptied, I steadied the house with one hand, counted the glasses, corks, bottles, and sinks with the other, which were 29, and as the houses came by, I counted them again, and finally I had all the houses in one bottle, which I drank. I'm not under the affluence of alcohol, as some finkel peep I am. I'm not half as thunk as you might drink. I fool so foolish, I don't know who is me, and the drunker I stand here, the longer I get.